We find ourselves in Genesis chapter 32 today, and I want to do several things before we jump in, okay? Number one, I want to summarize this story so you have the macro view of this story. Number two, I want to provide literary context in light of the previous chapter and the next. And maybe this kind of Bible study is new to you, but this will be helpful, I promise, if you're new to the Bible or if you're, a seasoned saint. Number three, I want to look at some important repeating ideas or words that you really should pay attention to in this chapter and do some deeper studies on your own with these ideas. Number four, I want to make some observations about the characters and the setting, or rather that's the fifth thing is the setting. And then the sixth thing we're going to do is just read through this chapter and make some initial observations, all right? So in Genesis chapter 32, to summarize this story, Jacob arrives in a place he refers to as God's camp when he encounters some angelic beings there. And in order to head back home, he's left Laban, his uncle in Padan Aram. He's heading back home, but he's going to have to come face to face with Esau and solve their problems that were left unaddressed when Jacob ran away for his life. And so Jacob ends up in this chapter scheming up a plan to butter up his brother Esau. He sends servants with gifts to Esau, and then the messengers return with news that Esau's coming with 400 men, Jacob. Jacob reacts out of fear, sends 3 servants ahead of him, gets all these gifts ready, separates them into 3 droves, and then sends them ahead of him to appease Esau. And after doing so, he sends his family over the stream of the Jabbok, this fort of the crossing, and he's left alone to wrestle a man who ends up being the very near presence and the face of God himself appearing to Jacob. Jacob then is found clinging to this mysterious man for blessing, and the mysterious figure changes Jacob's name, which only God can change someone's identity fundamentally in Scripture. Okay, so that's the summary of this story. That's what we're looking at. I want you to keep that in mind. The second thing to note is the literary context, all right? And so the chapter before this, in chapter 31, Jacob ran away from his uncle Laban after gaining a ton of wealth, getting rich, getting 2 wives and their maidservants, having 11 kids. He's been there 20 plus years. Laban chases him down because someone stole his household gods, which ends up being Rachel, his daughter, and she remains hidden. No one ever finds out. God actually warned Laban in a dream as he's chasing Jacob, and he says, Laban, don't mess with Jacob. And God rescues Jacob from the hand of Laban because God saw the affliction of Jacob during his time in Padan Aram under the authority of his uncle, and he defended Jacob, right, who ran away in fear of what might happen if things continued escalating. So Jacob's on the run, running from Laban. Laban finds him, has a dream. Jacob and Laban end up coming together, make a covenant that they're not going to harm each other, and Jacob moves on, enter chapter 32 right here, right? So that's the context of the previous chapter. What I want to do now, okay, is I want to have that in mind as I'm reading chapter 32. Here are the main ideas in chapter 31, right? I want to be thinking about, are there any connections between the main ideas in chapter 32 and the main ideas in chapter 31? When I see a repeating word or a repeating idea or a motif in chapter 32 right here, do I see those present in the previous chapter? Okay, I want to be asking these questions. So in the previous chapter, we saw favor with Laban, one of the ideas that are prevalent. We saw deception and cheating. We saw fleeing or being driven away. We saw foreigners in a house, God speaking in dreams, the angel of God, gaining material wealth and becoming really successful, increasing, right? We saw household gods and idolatry. We saw judgment, affliction, covenant, and then feasting with offering sacrifices. So that's how we link Genesis 32 to the previous chapter, thinking about those main ideas. And now the next chapter, chapter 33, Jacob's going to come to Esau to spoil this whole thing. I know you're like, I've never seen this coming. Jacob and Esau are going to end up meeting. Esau receives him with open arms, totally unexpected. No one saw that coming. Esau meets Jacob's family, invites Jacob and his family to come with him, but Jacob deceitfully moves on to Shechem, leaves his brother, takes his family, kind of runs away and scurries off to Shechem, where he buys land from Hamor, the ruler of the city Shechem. And then Jacob, when he gets there, builds his home, gets the land, erects an altar, dedicates it to God, and kind of sets up his family there. Okay. And in that chapter, some important themes will be bowing as servants, embracing, blessing, presents, like gifts, altars, land, company, and camps. Those are the ideas that will be present in that. Okay, so, and then what we want to do is zoom out a little bit. So that's on both ends of chapter 32, the chapters on both ends. We summarized that. We thought about the main ideas. I want to be thinking about that as best as I can as I read chapter 32. But then we want to zoom out a little more and look at the macro narrative of the entire Bible. So let's just think about what's happened so far in Genesis. This story in Genesis 32 comes after Adam and Eve's story, Cain and Abel's story, Noah's story, the flood, the Tower of Babel, Abraham and Isaac's story. And so in the macro narrative, this story is tracking with the promised seed of the woman in Genesis 3. We cannot lose sight of that, is that Genesis, these earlier accounts of the patriarchs of the faith, were tracking with the promised seed of the woman. Where's he coming? How is he coming? That kind of thing. Okay? Now we get to chapter 32, and the main ideas in this chapter are pretty fascinating. The face of either God or people, fear, favor, and blessing. There's gifts and presents. There's camps, servants, names. There's wrestling and striving. There's seeing or beholding, understanding. The thigh related to sacrifice and offerings. And then there's rescue and deliverance. Okay, so those are some main ideas and themes in this chapter. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed, like, I can't keep track of all this. But at least think about what I said and hang on to one of those things and look for it in this chapter, right? So as we read chapter 32, some observations just about Jacob as a character, not to make him fantastical. He's a real life person that lived on the earth. Jacob is going to react out of fear. He's very fear-driven. Jacob is still manipulating and attempting to control situations. He's using gifts and wealth to secure favor and blessing from Esau. Jacob is still scheming to get out of bad situations. He's very self-preserving. Jacob is very desperate in this passage. And then Jacob, while spiritually perceptive at times, other times he's not so spiritually perceptive, and he's actually blind in that regard. And then the last thing before we jump into the text, I know we're 7 minutes in, the setting is that Jacob and his family are, number one, leaving the region of Padan Aram, right? That's where Jacob's mom is from. That's where Jacob's 2 wives and maidservants are from. That's where he lived for 20 plus years. He's leaving that. Now he's in God's camp with some obvious angelic visitations. He's gonna cross the stream of the Jabbok. There's a crossing that takes place there. And then he's going to be on his way to Esau's home. So that's the overall setting geographically where Jacob and his family find themselves. Now let's read and just make some initial observations about this text. Verse 1, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. Now we know that Jacob's already encountered angels before. In chapter 28, he had a dream, and he's like, this is the place of God. I had no idea this was the house of God. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And so I just want to be thinking about 4 chapters earlier, he's like, this is God's house. So there's kind of a progression with that. So he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which actually means 2 camps. And Jacob, that's what my footnote says, and Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, right? So you can already, sense this guy is trying to get out of a bad situation and resolve the unresolved conflict between him and his brother. And he sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing these messengers, thus you shall say to my lord Esau. Now this is interesting that he identifies Esau as his lord, when actually it's Jacob will be served by the older, right? The older will serve the younger. So is he just lying, being deceptive, flattering? Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks. So Jacob's flexing a little bit, right? And I don't know if he's bragging or if he's just making a statement about how much he's increased to kind of share how, I can help you, Esau. I can benefit you. I have stuff for you. I've sent to tell my Lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. So, Jacob makes it crystal clear. He's very direct. Here's why I'm telling you all this, because I'm hoping to find some favor in your sight. And the messengers actually returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau. He's coming to meet you. And there are 400 men with him. Now that'd be terrifying. Jacob is already on edge. He's already freaking out, and now he hears that his brother, there's no context for this. Just your brother's coming with 400 men. and immediately he jumps to the worst case scenario, right? Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, so he responds and reacts out of fear rather than going to God and saying, what's going on here, He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, right, or presuming, we've seen this already, Abraham and Sarah. Essentially, Sarah comes to Abraham, and she's like, I think God's going to give us, a son through Hagar, my Egyptian servant. There's a lot of people doing what seems right in their own eyes and thinking without really bringing that to God. If Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape, right? So he divides the people in order that at least one camp will escape. If we stay together, we're all dead. But if we're separate, at least one will get away, okay? And we're not exactly told which camp necessarily he prefers, but I would suspect that Jacob would rather Rachel and Joseph be saved than Leah and her maidservants. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham. So now Jacob turns around, and who does he talk to? After he's already schemed up a plan, he kind of throws a prayer on that and covers it in prayer. God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, he's like, you gave me promises, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. Like, you told me this, God. This is your idea. This is your plan. And he's appealing to God's promises. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness you've shown to your servant, which is a very similar appeal that Jacob makes to Esau, isn't it? Right, where he's like, your servant has grown and increased. My Lord, I have gifts. Well, he's coming before God, and he's like, I am not worthy of anything good you've done for me. I don't deserve it. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan. So he's recalling how when he crossed initially, which is interesting that in this chapter there's two crossings. The initial crossing to Laban, and now going back home, crossing the Jabbok. And he's become two camps, right? So God has really increased him and followed through on his promise. And Jacob is really leaning on that and saying, you've promised, God. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I love that Jacob continues to recall the promises of God. He's appealing to God's own word. Not that he's holding God hostage, but he's saying, you are faithful, you are true, you don't lie. You said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Like you said, we'd increase tremendously. So he stayed there that night. Like there's no answer from God, no response. And from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milking camels, 40 cows, and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself. And he said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, and when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Like, who are you guys? Where are you going? Whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They were a present sent to my Lord. Once again, seems to be a kind of flattery, because Esau is not the Lord of Jacob. My Lord Esau. Moreover, he's behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third, and all who followed the droves, which means there are other people. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. Once again, Jacob assuming this role of servant, right? He's identifying as a servant of Esau, which either he's lying, he's being deceitful, he's flattering and using, talking his way out of this difficult situation, or he really does see himself as a kind of servant. But if we're to think about Jacob's history and the character he's already played thus far, it's hard to see any kind of change. Your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought, I may appease him. That's why I think Jacob is very cunning here. He's very shrewd. I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. This is what's important. The face in Scripture, often, not always, sometimes it's just the literal face, but to see Esau's face would mean that he has his approval, favor, and acceptance. Like they're good. They have right relationship, okay? Perhaps he will accept me. That's how I know this, right? Because seeing the face would mean acceptance. And so the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. And what you're about to see is that God did not respond to the prayer. God did not, at least nothing that we have recorded. And so now I think we're going to see God responding to Jacob's prayer and answering. The same night he arose, took his wives, 2 of them, his 2 female servants, they're not identified as Jacob's wives, and his 11 children, and they crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them, sent them across the stream, everything else he'd had, and this is important, Jacob is left entirely alone, with no one to lean on, no one to look to, nothing to trust in, stripped of everything for now, absolutely alone. And all of a sudden, like we see a man entering the scene and just starts wrestling with Jacob. No context, no discussion. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. In other words, this lasted a while. This was a long wrestling match. And if you're familiar with wrestling, you know how exhausting 2 minutes is. When the man saw he didn't prevail, Hebrew, I think, more appropriately would be wasn't able. It just promotes ability, or rather communicates ability to accomplish a task. Since he didn't prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. So we should be asking, why the hip socket? And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, right? This man doesn't talk. There's no words. The weirdest wrestling match, completely silent. It's like a silent film. Just wrestling. Just a bunch of grunting from 2 men. And all of a sudden, he touches his hip, puts it out of joint, and then he goes, "Let me go, the day has broken." Right? So we have 2 times that the author is drawing attention to the day is coming. The light is breaking. But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." What does Jacob want? He wants blessing. And he said to him, "What is your name?" And I just want to go, well, didn't you get blessed already by your dad? Weren't you already blessed by God, who has given you abundant wealth and possessions? Right? So it's kind of odd that Jacob's like, "Bless me." What blessing are you looking for, bro? And he said, "What is your name?" That's an interesting way to respond to "bless me." What's your name? I just think of how Jesus, cast out demons from that one man who would break out of shackles. He was in the region of the Gerasenes. And as he's approaching, Jesus goes, "What's your name?" And he goes, "My name is Legion, we are many." But either way, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob." There's an identity change happening, right? "But Israel now. For you have striven with God and with men, and you've prevailed." Now the man did not prevail in whatever it is that he was trying to do, but Jacob prevailed. What is it that Jacob specifically prevailed in doing? What was he successful in? What was the accomplishment? Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." Right? So it's like, "I told you who I am. Who are you?" But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" It's like, "Because you just asked my name. I thought we're on friendly terms." And there he blessed him. What did he ask for? Blessing. What did it involve? A name change, an identity change, a kind of new beginning. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means the face of God. For I have seen God face to face. What's interesting is in the Hebrew, I noticed that both these were plural. But nonetheless, I have seen God, which face to face is a Hebrew idiom of just saying personally, experientially, in a very individual, direct way. and also it promotes favor and acceptance. How do I know that? Because he's going to say, yet my life has been delivered. So apparently there is an assumption that Jacob operates with that is, hey, seeing God face to face, the life should not be delivered, which is what we see in Moses. God will say to Moses, no one can see my face and live. The sun rose upon him. Once again, we have the third time, the sun, the daybreak, the light breaking through, as he passed Penuel limping because of his hip. Now he has a new walk. Now he has a new identity. Now he has a new blessing. Now it's a new day. So there's all kinds of like new beginnings just echoing throughout this. As he passed Penuel limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, and now we have some commentary on the Israelites' tradition. To this day, the people of Israel don't eat the sinew or the tendon of the thigh that is on the hip socket, right? So we have the thigh, we have the socket, we have the hip, and we have the tendon. Because this man, or not just a man, touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the tendon of his thigh. What God touched fundamentally changed the trajectory of Jacob's life. New identity, new name, new beginning, new walk, new day. All of that because God tangibly touched Jacob in a very personal and direct way in which he blessed him. The blessing came through a kind of laying on of hands, changing the name, interactions. You've striven with God and man. So there's a lot of weird details in this chapter. Hey, there's actually so much more that I didn't get into in this video because it requires its own separate deep dive teaching. For example, what is the deal with the two camps in Genesis 32? What's the hidden truth about this wrestling match between Jacob and this mysterious figure? And what other deep connections and revelations hide underneath the surface of this passage? That's what we address in the deep dive teaching. To gain access to the full extended study, consider joining our team of monthly supporters on AboveReproachMinistry.com. You'll get instant access to all of our extra teachings and content as it gets released. So thank you so much for supporting this ministry, and I'll see you on the website.